and how you brought it all together.
Oh, thanks so much, Ron. I'm not quite sure if I'm going to be able to follow that really generous introduction. You may have oversold the book, because I think that we raise probably more questions than we provide answers, but certainly they're important questions for all of us in this extended decentralized network to be thinking about. So in any case, I'm really grateful for this invitation. Despite the hour, I was thinking about how last November, Ron probably pulled together many of the people in this room to drink champagne early in the morning as we were celebrating during our evening freedom dinner his great contributions to liberty, as we gave him a virtual Fisher Achievement Award, which is our biggest individual honor that we give out each year. So I figured the least I can do is wake up early for this kind of event to celebrate my my humble book here. But I do hope you find it as important a book as Ron has suggested, because it does address an important and urgent situation. For 18 months, we have been seeing the world through this very unusual lens of a global health crisis. That's true, we're in one. We need people to see another important truth. We're in a global freedom crisis as well. And my big hypothesis is simply that 2020 may be remembered as a pivotal year in world history, perhaps for very negative reasons, but this is not preordained. There's a lot of history that's going to be unfolding in the months and years to come. And the organizations that I get the privilege of collaborating with as partners of Atlas Network are in very high leverage positions. So we might, at the end of the day, have some real influence over whether the history of this decade will be one that favors freedom or sees its decline. So I'm contending that the groups that make up the freedom movement are really undervalued assets for revitalizing liberal democracy and ensuring a more free and prosperous future. And in section 1 of the book, I give some flavor about this community of Atlas Network partners as the network exists in 2021. As Ron said, it's spread over nearly, there's about 500 organizations in nearly 100 countries. It operates with a combined annual budget that's a shade over $1 billion when you add up all the budgets of these organizations. So that's not an insignificant number. I also share in this sort of opening section that the typical group in our movement is rather modestly funded. It has to be rather scrappy. The average group in our network is about 10 years old and has 7 full-time employees. The median budget within the network is just over $280,000 right now. These are lean organizations that are often run as a labor of love. And if it seems unlikely that the world can be changed by modest organizations like this, I've got a chapter in this opening section that talks about some of the amazing improvements in human freedom that have happened over the last 40 years, and noting how our partners have played key roles, from Thatcher's privatizations to the end of apartheid in South Africa. Our partners there were on the right side of that history, from the broken windows theory of policing that was popularized by the Manhattan Institute and which revitalized American cities in the 1990s, the end of hyperinflation in Latin America, to a big change in development economics, creating there's now a much greater appreciation than there was about the importance of property rights for the poor and the need for entrepreneurial capitalism to create an inclusive and lasting prosperity. You know, these are big accomplishments, and this first section of the book really makes the case that it's energetic, lean organizations like Mannkal Economic Education Foundation and its peers that can be really cost-effective agents of change, and this really should be better appreciated than it is. The second section of the book is about the state of the free society around the world. And for me, this was the most fun part of the book to put together. I got to edit down some transcripts of conversations that I convened with fascinating people from different parts of the world. I have to somewhat sheepishly confess that while I had conversations for every other continent your unique island, continent, nation fails to be represented here. So I'm hoping that today's Q&A can fill this gap. But I do think that you'll be interested in exploring some of the questions that were taken up in these chapters in the middle of the book. 10 years after the Arab Spring, has anything changed for the better in the Middle East and North Africa? In Latin America, how can we wipe away the destructive characterizations of capitalism that have now allowed authoritarian populists to strangle much of the continent? In the Asia conversation, we looked at the decline of Hong Kong and the temptation of the Chinese model of authoritarianism mixed with markets. Another question, will the new African Free Trade Agreement help Africa fulfill expectations that by the year 2050, it will have a bigger middle-class consumer market than China? Is that realistic or not? In Europe, we talked about whether the post-Brexit United Kingdom would be able to deliver a competitive shock to the rest of the continent that it deeply needs to shake off the shackles of EU bureaucracy. We also had a great conversation about the state of things in the United States and Canada. And the conversation about the US really took its cue from a very interesting finding from another thing that's in section 2 of the book, which is the findings of a new empirical study that I've been involved in called the Global Index of Economic Mentality. It's an index that looks at how people see economic topics. Do they think that free markets produce efficient and fair results? Are people responsible for their own economic well-being? Or do you need government to come in and correct things to make them more efficient or more fair? It's a pretty interesting project that relies on mining information from the World Values Survey. I can talk a little bit more about this in Q&A if you'd like, but the finding that worries Americans like me the most is that while the United States ranks pretty high overall in the Global Index of Economic Mentality rankings, meaning it's fairly free market, number 4 overall out of the 79 countries that we had sufficient data on. When you compare the economic mentality of people who are over 40 years old and those who are younger than 40 years old in these survey results, there's no country in the world that has as large a gap as the United States. Let me see if I can share my screen for a second just to show you the overall rankings here. Let's see if I can do this. I'll go to my PowerPoint. And so these are the 76, there we go, countries that are ranked. And you'll see that Australia here is number 10. Maybe this is too small for you to see in the room that you're in. Australia ranks 10th in the overall rankings. Your Kiwi neighbors steal headlines as the top scoring country overall in the global index. But in Australia, we also see the same split that I mentioned in the US between young and old. If the US has the biggest gap of young people trending more socialist than their older generation, Australia is number 9 when you look at the rankings that way. And that's actually more of a function of the US, the older generation in the US scoring quite high. Your youth, it turns out, are just as socialist as ours, at least as far as we can measure it through the Global Index of Economic Mentality tool. So, what are we going to do about it? That's the live question. And I think it's a question that requires long-term thinking. There's no quick fix, but I do believe it needs to be tackled with some urgency, because we are at an inflection point in history, I believe. We just can't be complacent. And when I think about the situation in the US, I think of 3 main reasons that young people are skewing socialist. The first reason is simply that they have the luxury of not truly understanding socialism. They have the luxury of thinking that it means just sharing and being nice. And perhaps this can only be disabused by a very difficult encounter with socialism as it really is. I think that as a second factor, younger generations have been hurt by some trends that began long before COVID, but which have been worse during this era we've been living through, sort of overly paranoid about their own safety, insecure about their own capabilities, and therefore overly deferential to authority. And a third reason I think we have a problem with young people failing to appreciate the free market and so on is that we have a media culture that's very problematic in the US certainly, and I think this is shared in other Western democracies or advanced democracies, where the media is invested in sustaining narratives that keep us in this hyper polarized political playing field where the extremes are sort of feeding off of their animosity toward one another. And somewhat ironically, I make a case in the final chapter of the book that this third factor provides, I think, an opening and some reason for hope. As political debate has become more polarized, there's greater potential for a disaffected center to come together. So in the final chapter of the book, I sketch out my thinking about how our groups in the freedom movement could energize a new sort of common sense centrism around classical liberal values that I think can be attractive to those who are becoming more wary of the more extreme elements in their own political tribes. I do think that we need to be cognizant of the way that our classical liberal principles have been maligned and mischaracterized by many groups. So I make the case that we need to lean into the challenge of demonstrating that we are inclusive and compassionate and really anchored in a strong belief about the legal equality of all people. And as I see it, this shouldn't be too hard. This is authentically who we are. We're working hard here in Atlas Network's 40th anniversary year to get better with our branding and our messaging. So I hope that after you enjoy the book, I hope that you'll be exploring atlasnetwork.org and you can give us some feedback on what's there. We have really wonderful stories to share. So there's no excuse for not winning a bigger consensus around our ideas. I'm gonna show just a couple more slides here before I close. Am I still sharing my screen? I'm sorry. I wanted to share just a couple of slides to show the headlines that I think reflect the work of our partners. Many of you are familiar with the group in Indonesia that Rainer Hofer leads, lowering food costs for the poor by opening trade in Indonesia. In Costa Rica, we're very proud of the efforts of Ideas Lab that has rolled back these luxury pensions for government officials, trying to prove that those who favor the free market detest cronyism and government granted privileges. In the US, more access to healthcare came about as the Mercatus Center got rid of some of the regulations that were limiting the ability of healthcare providers to adapt to the COVID crisis. I know that we have listening in today, Ahmad Manarakizi from Burundi. So proud of his organization, which is now a finalist for our Templeton Freedom Award, creating opportunities for free enterprise to alleviate poverty by removing restrictions on entering the formal sector and barriers to trade. Last year, one of our Templeton Freedom Award finalists was an American group that showed how private incentives can solve conservation challenges, which is something that's not very well appreciated by most people who assume that if you love the environment, you love big government solutions to it. And then, of course, the kind of work that Mannkal does is done by many of our partners around the world. This shows how one of our partners in Greece is bringing the ideas of liberty to new audiences in creative ways. These are just a sample of the kinds of things that that our Atlas Network partners are able to accomplish. I'll stop there and stop sharing my screen. Can you see me again?
We didn't see that bit, Brad. We didn't see the previous.
Sorry?
We didn't see the previous screen share there, Brad.
You didn't?
We just,
oh, no.
Yeah.
They were beautiful images. I enjoyed them. Sorry about my technical dysfunction here. But but in any case, I hope that maybe we can figure out how to pull those up in a second. But I hope that some of these stories, and you can certainly find them all over the Atlas Network website now, I hope that they help convince you of what you'll think you'll find in the book, which is that we really have every reason to be hopeful about our future, and that we should really take to heart that we're part of something that is special, a global community to try to secure a freer future through persuasion, through the engagement of the battle of ideas, through civic discourse, and being able to set a good example for that, I think is a wonderful contribution in itself. And of course, we've seen that the principles of classical liberalism do work in practice. So, I think that we should just take to heart the need to spread the good news and work towards building a bigger freedom movement. So maybe I'll pause there, and maybe we can talk about whether you have any questions about the book.
Brad, it's encouraging that there are so many groups and people that are opening their minds to new solutions. One example is the Multidimensional Society in November. The whole theme of the conference in Guatemala in November is to devise policies to restore economies. That's the whole thrust of it. Tomorrow in Perth, all the vice chancellors of all the universities are getting together at a special long lunch session to devise policies on what they must do to the education system to cope with the totally changed circumstances. A couple of years ago, those people were so set and so safe in the existing model, and now it's just fascinating seeing them open their minds, looking for new solutions, so that there's a fertile field for this for these ideas, Brad, more than there ever has been before.
Yeah, indeed. Sorry, I cut you off there at the end, Ron. What was the final sentence there?
Are you finding this this same sort of changing people are opening their minds to new ideas?
Yeah, I do feel like while there's so many reasons to be pessimistic about what's happened over the last 18 months, and in some ways I think I've been surprised at just how deferential to top-down orders people have been in the US and in other countries as well. We do see the seeds of resistance starting to sprout up, and I think there's no place where that's as true as in the education space. And here I guess I'm most versed in what's happened in the US, but as many of our children have been unable to attend school, and they're participating virtually like this over Zoom or other platforms, parents have gotten a window into just how little learning happens in most American government-run schools. And they look at private schools that had to adapt in ways that were much more nimble and much more, because at the end of the day, they had to answer to paying customers in a way that the government schools did not. And the government schools needed to please the teachers' unions that prioritized safety and getting paychecks at home over all else. And the private schools managed to figure out ways to keep kids safe and keep kids learning. And it's really created this, unfortunately, it's exacerbated a divide where low-income parents have no good options. But the upside is that it has created a lot of agitation and a lot of willingness to look at new models. So certainly on that standpoint, I think that we're seeing something very healthy, which is sort of a reappraisal of the status quo. And that certainly is something that we need to seize the moment and be engaged in those conversations about how we create a new normal that's actually more free, delivers more choice than in the past.
Okay. I've got another question. Can you do a roll call to see if how many people actually zoomed in? Have we got?
I think unless I have missed something here, and you've already seen that my technical abilities are not, shouldn't have put me in charge of the Zoom, but I think just Ahmad from Burundi.
Okay.
I'll have a follow-on question from Ron, if that's all right.
This is Rico Stevens from University of Notre Dame in Western Australia.
Fantastic.
Ron sort of asked the question I want to ask about the optimism and pessimism in response to the lockdowns and people's response to the lockdowns, and whether we can use this perhaps as a chance to show people that freedom is the way forward, and particularly I'm thinking of people who are more inclined to be in favor of policies such as the health response, but have seen huge costs in thinking of New Zealand and Australia with the quarantines and the huge costs these are having on individual lives. But as a follow-on to that, I wonder if you could comment on the extent to which the rhetoric in the COVID crisis has been largely dominated by health professionals rather than economists. At least in Australia and New Zealand, it seems that the ideas of economists have been parked to one side, and that the media and the general rhetoric is all about the health-only response rather than an economic response, which takes into account individual rights and individual freedoms and individual economic welfare. So I just wonder if you see if that's an Australasia-specific thing, or do you see this more from your more global perspective as well?
Yeah, no, I think that you're not unique in that. I think that we've all been maybe a little bit hesitant to weigh in on things that we don't know. You can imagine if the rate of contagion and the rate of death per case, if those wound up being as high as initially projected, that perhaps we would react and say that some of the top-down solutions were totally justified. I think that it's sort of dangerous for us to pretend to be epidemiologists and to try to analyze that with our own sort of preconceived notions about where we want policies to land. But I think that that's exactly what we've seen from the sort of the mainstream media that's dominated the conversation over the past 2 years, that there seems to be a real willingness to only look at a very narrow health problem at the exclusion of all the other health problems that have been neglected by the hyper focus on trying to limit COVID infection and COVID related deaths. And this does seem that it's somewhat perverse. One of my favorite chapters in the book is the discussion that we had with other North American friends of Atlas Network. And in that conversation, I included a woman named Lenore Skenazy, who is the head of a sort of a parenting movement called Free Range Kids. She's done a lot of wonderful work to make us aware of how, as society gets safer, we seem to become more and more obsessed with how unsafe we are, and that the goal of trying to keep kids from never encountering problems makes them less resilient to manage their own problems later on. And you might be able to draw a line between this helicopter parenting that keeps kids dependent on others for their safety, to the inability that we see now in universities to deal with uncomfortable ideas and things that don't fit their own pre-existing narrative. And from there, I think you get to a willingness to let government authorities tell you whether you can go and visit your friends on a Sunday afternoon. So I think that it's interesting to think about this rise of sort of a safetyism at the exclusion of other concerns, and being willing to stomach top-down solutions to address one problem, while keeping us very blind to other problems that people are silently suffering with that are just as worrisome. So, I like to think that there's an emerging sort of common sense around how we've not weighted things correctly in our public discourse during COVID. And I believe that the lesson that we should be able to preach with real authority is that it's where we're seeing resilience and where we're seeing creativity is when you have decentralized decision making. It's in the magic of the restaurants that figured out how to stay open by adapting all of their services to a totally different reality that wasn't coordinated by any of the governors that told people to just stay home. It's the places where people have been locked down often that have had the most disruptions to their economies, and without really appreciable health benefits, as we can tell so far from the data that's coming in. So that was kind of a long-winded way around your question, but I hope that shed some light.
Doug's got a question.
Hang on, Doug.
Brad, Doug Hall. I think we met in Canary Islands.
Yeah.
Just following on from that one-dimensional view, it seems that I think the future in terms of analysis is going to be very interesting. And I just wonder whether you're aware of any analysis that's already being undertaken that's essentially a multi-dimensional analysis. Because I mean, Sweden has been vilified for many, and I certainly see Sweden as taking a very balanced view. And deaths isn't the only thing that matters in society. And I've tried to even things out as much as possible. I also wonder about islands, because to me, islands, the problem with island dwellers is they can suffer from the psychology of castle dwellers, and they think that they're impregnable. They don't need to put, they put defences up, and then of course the inevitable happens and they get invaded. So I just wonder, an analysis across islands, like, I mean, I heard an interview just today from Iceland, and they seem to be taking it very differently from the way Australia's adopted. Britain's obviously an island, but they're a bit closer to the continent. So I just wondered if you're aware of any preliminary analysis that's looking at that multidimensional aspect, because it's really that multidimensional evaluation that's going to tell us who actually chose the best options overall.
Yeah, I wish I had a satisfying answer, because I think that's at the heart of what we need to be developing and creating. And I know some Atlas Network partners have been discussing this in a preliminary way, but there's nothing I've seen published that speaks to that sort of central question that we need to answer. So I'm sorry to disappoint you that I don't have anything for you.
Just one other comment. I mean, it seems, why is Australia, I mean, in many ways, I don't know what other people think, but it seems extraordinary that given where we've come from, a fairly free society, that we've almost adopted one of the, almost like the Chinese management solution. And I just wonder whether that's because Australians in general have never suffered a totalitarian regime, except recent refugees who have. And certainly in places like Melbourne, there were blocks of flats locked up that were populated largely by recent refugees, and they were just traumatized by the experience. So I just also think that in terms of the decisions that countries and governments made relative to where their cultural experience has been is probably an important aspect as well.
Yeah, one of the interesting things about this global index of economic mentality is that that the countries of Eastern Europe tend to appear, especially among the younger, the under 40 generation, they tend to be more free market than many other nations. And maybe the working hypothesis there is that they still have memories, or have understood the stories from their parents of what was endured under communism. For a lot of people in my country, that's now a history lesson that's that doesn't seem connected to their lives. They didn't grow up sort of understanding this, that at one point there were sort of two competing models in the world, and that's what the Cold War was all about. And you had to really digest what it meant to be on the other side of the Berlin Wall and to live with authoritarianism. Unless you've actually encountered that and understood it in a sort of visceral way, I think it becomes tempting to imagine that there must be an authority called government that can create fair solutions, and why should we expect anything less if they don't have the experience of what it looks like in practice?
Yeah, that's Gavin Bunning, one of our Mannkal ambassadors, right?
We, we've got a bit of a crisis, at least a serious crisis in this state, in that our state government, or at least the supposed free enterprise party, has been totally demolished, have about 2 seats in the lower house. And the obvious issues are to do with on the one hand, the sort of caliber of those who are currently sort of standing for Parliament, and perhaps more importantly, the leadership of the party is deteriorating. I suppose where I'm leading is that I think the only answer that we have in the longer term is that younger people who today are sort of probably horrified at the thought of standing for Parliament in terms of the example that's been set to them by the existing Parliament. But on the other hand, somehow we've got to encourage them and find ways of getting people like those associated with Mannkal to ultimately stand for Parliament. And I was wondering what experience you might have had, sort of for better or worse, in terms of how to attract good young people into politics.
Yeah, that's a little beyond the scope of what Atlas does itself. As maybe I should describe a little bit more. Ron is really generous in his comments about how we connect 500 organizations around the world. We really realize that the great benefit that we can provide is to be specialists at helping people learn from one another, and that it's not our place to really have the answers or to even suggest that we do about how things should be accomplished more effectively at in particular places. That we really think that it's local vision that's going to make the difference. So some of our partners focus a lot on that question of getting young people engaged in the political process at the same time that they're becoming educated about sound economic principles. But we don't take any active role in that ourselves. So I'm as much of an observer as Ron would be to this challenge of engaging young people and sharing. I think in too many places we see people that assume that the most comfortable future they have is in a government position. So sometimes I think the big lesson is to encourage people to be entrepreneurs and to create wealth, and to understand why that's a really noble calling when so many of their peers probably disparage it as being somehow linked to this, greedy immorality that they confusingly associate with free market capitalism. I share your concern that at the end of the day, we need both, this taking up of understanding of sound economics and why limited government works, and you need the people with the courage to get involved in the messy business of politics. In the US, there are a lot of groups that sort of specialize in exactly that, in training people to run for office and how to be articulate spokespeople for our principles. That's kind of part of the ecosystem that we live in. But I don't have a particular specialization in that political part.
Ben, I'm going to call on Michael Sutherland, a long-term Liberal Party member, a politician, who's one of the very few politicians in our state who shows interest in youth. And Michael, say a few words of your experience. I'll you'll be on camera.
I think that it's what Gavin said is correct. How do you get young people involved? We do have a lot of young people involved in the Liberal Party, but unfortunately, a lot of them get factionalized and they get involved in the minutiae of the party, the internal workings, and they don't look to the outside and what's actually happening outside. And of course, the media is relentless, as you know. And what happens is a lot of people would say, well, why would I want to go into Parliament or be in the public eye if I'm constantly under scrutiny? Terrible things can happen to me. It's better just to sit back. But we've got a real problem here, as Gavin said, where we've only got 2 members left due to a lazy team, largely due to COVID and due to people that just didn't get off their backsides and look for alternative things. So it's not an easy thing to solve, but we do have, for instance, the women's division has also got a emerging women project and whatnot. But we had a premier here who Ron would know much better than me, and Gavin would say Charles Court. And Sir Charles Court said that Parliament should be made up of the butcher, the baker, and the candlestick maker. So in other words, we had a history, he's gone.
Is Rafe is joining us?
We had a history in this country of people that came to Parliament that were tradesmen, that were engine drivers, doctors, lawyers, what you call it, of the society. And now what are we getting? We're getting union hacks, and we're getting people that worked in electoral offices from the Liberal Party. And I think that there was a decision now made in that report of the Liberal Party saying if you worked for a politician, you couldn't pre-select for 2 years. So maybe that's not a bad idea. So anyway, I don't want to chew your ears off, but it's not an easy solution. Thank you.
Well, we've got some thoughts in there that should be developed. Any more questions, please? Do you have a question, Jenny? Jenny asked a question, and we have the answer. Jenny says, "How much is the book?" It's $30, better price than you get at Amazon.
It's not fast.
Brad, this question of attracting people to politics, surely a good grounding public choice economics is fundamental, because I mean, the game of politics is fundamentally corrupting. And what I mean by that is that well-intentioned people go into Parliament and then they end up being seduced by the career, and then they do whatever it takes to get re-elected. And it seems to me that public choice is one of the potential saving graces, that at least people have been trained to think about, I might be doing these things for myself rather than the people I say are the beneficiaries. So a bit of self-reflection and honesty might be just enough to try and minimise the number of people that fall into that long-term political career trap.
Yeah, and it makes me think about the sort of the founding story of Atlas Network. It goes back to the days right after World War II. While we weren't founded until 1981, we were celebrating our 40th anniversary this year. Anthony Fisher, our founder, became interested in the project of defeating socialism and reviving the market economy after he fought in World War II as a Royal Air Force pilot in Britain. He read The Road to Serfdom that Hayek had published in 1945, and he discovered that Hayek was just down the road at the LSE. So he went to his office at the London School of Economics and told him, "I think you've diagnosed the problem. I intend to run for Parliament. I'm going to work to set things right, and take us off this road to serfdom and back towards appreciating individualism and the market economy." And Hayek told him that that's a terrible, terrible idea. He said that politicians are face incentives the way anybody else does. I guess that the public choice school hadn't been really developed as it would be later. But Hayek just had this intuition that politicians were not going to lead a change of opinion, and they were not going to be doing courageous things to affect policy until there was a public consensus. He said, Anthony Fisher, you're going to be a very unsuccessful politician if you stick with your principles, or you're going to be a very unprincipled advocate for our cause if you manage to succeed in politics, because you're only going to do it by paying attention to where public opinion is. We have the much more challenging project of trying to change public opinion so that it becomes advantageous for politicians to try to reform policies in the direction of freer markets. So that's really why Fisher thought it through, created a think tank in Britain that then became a model. And Atlas Network's whole purpose has been to help others that were trying to do the same thing in their own countries, so those groups can avoid some of the mistakes others have made, so they can climb the learning curve faster and continue to learn from one another and be challenged to become great in this this business of promoting liberty. So it's interesting, from the very beginning there was sort of this tension that often the incentives in politics are such that you can't be disruptive, and that the bigger project is in getting people to appreciate the principles of public choice economics, the principles of understanding why entrepreneurial capitalism is such a great engine of progress. So anyway, I think you're very right on that point.
Yeah. No more questions? Fred, we're going to let you have breakfast.
It's been a real pleasure to join you all. So thank you very much for inviting me for this this event.
Thank you for being with us, Brad, and I look forward to seeing you in Guatemala.
Indeed.
In
Thanks,
November.
everyone. Later.
Thanks.
Thanks,
Bye
Brad.
now.
Thank you.